My mother-in-law secretly transferred our house into her name while my husband and I were on vacation. She stood at the door. "This is no longer your house." I smiled and said only, "Check the mailbox." She didn't know that. A month before the trip, I had done something. Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say that when you marry someone, you marry their whole family. I used to smile at that and think, how true, how beautiful. I don't smile at that saying anymore. My name is Sarah Calloway. And yes, I kept my maiden name hyphenated after the wedding, which was the first thing my mother-in-law, Patricia Mercer, ever found fault with. "It's Mercer now," she told me the day after our wedding, standing in my own kitchen with a coffee mug she'd brought from her own house. "You're a Mercer." She said it the way people say, "You're welcome on my property." I filed the comment away and let it go because Daniel, my husband, was standing right there with that look on his face, the one that said, "Please, Sarah, not today." Daniel and I had been together for 6 years before we married, and I'd known from the beginning that Patricia was a complicated woman. She was a widow. She had devoted 30 years of her life to raising Daniel and his younger sister, Renee, and she had never quite accepted that those children grew up and chose their own lives. Daniel was her favorite. Her son, and I, the woman he chose, was an inconvenience she had learned to tolerate at holidays. We bought our house 3 years ago, a craftsman bungalow in a quiet neighborhood outside of Columbus, Ohio. 3 bedrooms, a big backyard, a porch where I drank my morning coffee in the summers and watched the squirrels argue over the bird feeder. We were proud of that house. We'd saved for 5 years for the down payment, and our names were on the mortgage together, the deed recorded at the Franklin County Recorder's Office. Our house, our names. Patricia visited often, too often maybe, but I tried to be gracious. She would walk through the rooms the way a landlord walks through an apartment, touching the windowsills, peering into closets, commenting on what we hadn't fixed yet. "This grout needs redoing," she'd say. Or, "Daniel, this is the kind of house that needs a proper man's attention." I was standing right there when she said things like that. She knew exactly what she was doing. The first real warning sign came 18 months before everything fell apart. Patricia had offered us money, a generous check, she called it, to help with the roof. The roof did need some work. We were tempted. But when Daniel read the attached letter from her personal attorney, there was language in it that made my stomach tighten. Something about an investment interest and right of first ownership upon sale or transfer. I sat at the kitchen table that night and read those words 3 times. Daniel said I was overreacting. Patricia, he explained, just wanted to feel useful. She was lonely. She was his mother. We declined the check. Patricia didn't speak to us for 2 months. The second warning sign was smaller but colder. Last April, Patricia stopped by unannounced while Daniel was at work. She asked to use the bathroom, which of course I said yes to. And when I went upstairs 10 minutes later to check on her, she was standing in our bedroom doorway, looking at the room as if she were mentally rearranging it. She didn't hear me come up the stairs. For just a moment, her expression was something I had never seen on a person's face directed at a house. Possession. "Patricia?" I said. She turned. She smiled. "Just admiring the light," she said. "Daniel always did love a good east-facing room." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about that expression on her face, and I told myself I was being paranoid. But I wasn't, was I? Some part of me, the part that had been watching Patricia for 3 years, already knew what she was capable of. I just didn't know yet how far she was willing to go. Daniel and I planned our vacation in June, 2 weeks in Portugal, Lisbon, and the Algarve coast. We'd been talking about it for years. Patricia, when she heard, went very quiet. Then she said, "2 weeks is a long time to leave a house empty." Daniel laughed and said we had a neighbor who checked the mail. Patricia said nothing more. We left on a Friday morning in early July. The flight was long, the wine was good, and by the time we reached our rented apartment in Lisbon with its blue tile walls and its view of the Tagus River, I had almost let myself forget the look on Patricia's face in our bedroom doorway. Almost. We came home on a Sunday. The taxi pulled up to our house and Daniel got out first, rolling a suitcase up the front walk. I was still paying the driver when I heard Patricia's voice. She had been waiting. She was standing on our porch, with her arms folded and her chin lifted, and when Daniel said, "Mom, what are you doing here?" she looked not at him, but at me. "This isn't your house anymore," she said, her voice perfectly level, as if she were announcing a weather forecast. "I had it transferred. It's done. You need to find somewhere else to stay tonight." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Daniel made a sound I had never heard from him before. My suitcase sat on the front walk. The neighbor's sprinklers came on across the street, and I looked at Patricia Mercer, my mother-in-law who had just told me I was homeless, and I smiled. "Check the mailbox, Patricia," I said. She blinked. Just once. Let me tell you what that smile cost me, because it wasn't peace or triumph or confidence. It was performance. The moment I said those words and turned away from Patricia to pick up my suitcase, my hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. Daniel was already on the phone. I could hear his voice rising. "What do you mean you transferred it, Mom? That's not possible." And Patricia was answering him with that infuriating calm she always wore when she knew she held the cards. I walked past both of them, unlocked our front door with my own key, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. I stood in our front hallway for a long moment. It smelled the same: old wood, lemon cleaner, the faint vanilla of the candle I'd burned before we left. Everything looked the same. My grandmother's quilt was folded over the arm of the couch. Daniel's hiking boots were by the door. But when I pressed my palm against the wall, I felt something I had never felt in that house before. Uncertainty about whether the wall was still mine to touch. That feeling, that cold, vertiginous feeling of the floor shifting beneath what you thought was solid ground, was the worst thing Patricia had ever done to me. Worse than the snide comments at Christmas. Worse than the investment interest language in the check letter. She had reached inside the thing that was most ours and made it feel conditional. I went to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, drank it standing at the sink, and gave myself exactly 5 minutes to be afraid. I want to be honest about that fear because I think it matters. The fear wasn't just about the house, it was about Daniel. We'd been standing at the door of our own home, and his mother had just committed what I was fairly certain was a crime. And he was out there on the porch, still talking to her, still trying to understand her, still, in some part of himself, hoping she had a reasonable explanation. I loved my husband. But in that moment, as I stood at the kitchen sink and listened to his voice through the wall, I understood something with absolute clarity. If I was going to fix this, I was going to have to be the one who did it. The 5 minutes ended. I put the glass down. First, I needed to know what, exactly, she had done. In Ohio, transferring real property requires a deed, a signed, notarized deed, recorded with the county recorder's office. Our names were on that deed. For Patricia to have transferred the property to herself, someone would have had to sign our names. That was forgery. That was fraud. The question was, how had she done it? Who had helped her? And, most chilling, had anyone at the recorder's office allowed it without noticing that something was wrong? I opened my laptop at the kitchen table. Daniel came inside 20 minutes later. His face was pale and his jaw was set, and he sat down across from me without speaking for a moment. "She says she has a deed," he finally said. "I know." "She says it's legitimate, that she found some kind of, some legal mechanism." "There is no legal mechanism," I said, keeping my voice very steady. "We didn't sign anything. We didn't consent to anything. She forged our signatures, Daniel, or she paid someone to." He put his face in his hands. I watched him. I felt a sharp, complicated love for him in that moment, and also a very clear-eyed recognition that grief was going to have to wait. "I need you to trust me," I said, "and I need you to not call her back tonight. Can you do that?" He looked up. He nodded. That night, while Daniel slept fitfully and Patricia's SUV sat in our driveway, she had not left, a fact that made my skin crawl. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a yellow legal pad, and I thought through everything I knew and everything I needed to find out. I made a list. Number 1, pull the Franklin County property records online and find the fraudulent deed. Number 2, contact a real estate attorney first thing Monday morning. Number 3, file a police report for deed fraud. Number 4, contact the county recorder's office directly. Number 5, and this one I underlined twice, do not tip her off. Because here was the thing about Patricia Mercer. She was meticulous and she was patient, and she had clearly planned this for longer than I wanted to think about, which meant that if I moved carelessly, she would move faster. I needed to be quieter than she expected, calmer. I needed to make her think she had already won, while I built the walls she couldn't see. But there was also something else, something I hadn't told Daniel yet, something I had done, quietly, carefully, almost on instinct, exactly 1 month before we left for Portugal. I looked at the legal pad. I wrote one more item at the bottom of the list, circled it, and allowed myself, just barely, to breathe. Number 6, check what's already in motion. Monday came. Patricia's car was gone by the time I woke up. She'd left sometime in the early hours, which told me she was smart enough not to overplay her hand on the first night. She wanted us disoriented, not immediately on the phone with law enforcement. She wanted us to come to her. We didn't. I was at the offices of Lerner and Associates, a real estate litigation firm on High Street in Columbus, by 9 in the morning. Daniel sat next to me. I had called ahead on Sunday evening and spoken with an associate named Marcus Webb. And when I walked in with my laptop and my legal pad and the printout I had pulled from the Franklin County property search the night before, Marcus Webb took one look at it and said, "This is deed fraud. This is a felony in Ohio." The document on his desk showed a quitclaim deed filed on July 8th, 5 days after we'd boarded our flight to Lisbon, transferring ownership of our home from Daniel and Sarah Mercer Calloway to Patricia Ann Mercer. The signatures on the deed were not ours. The notary stamp was from a man named Gerald Holt, a notary public with an office in Westerville, about 20 minutes from Patricia's home. "Someone signed your names," Marcus said, "and someone notarized those signatures. That's 2 people involved, minimum." Daniel's face had gone very still. I had watched him move through denial and into something harder in the past 36 hours, and I was grateful for it. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I needed him clear. "What do we do?" he asked. "You file a police report today," Marcus said. "Deed fraud is handled by the county prosecutor's office. I'll draft an emergency motion to have the fraudulent deed voided. That's called a quiet title action. We'll also contact the county recorder and flag the filing. And," he looked at me, "you said on the phone you had taken some protective steps before your vacation." "Yes," I said. He waited. I had learned in the months leading up to our vacation, after the check incident, after the bedroom doorway moment, that deed fraud was more common than most people knew. It happened especially to properties with clear titles and no mortgage activity, properties that sat quiet for a while. I had read about it online, at first out of vague anxiety, and then with the focused attention of someone who recognizes a pattern. I had called the Franklin County Recorder's Office in June and asked about their property alert system, a free service that sends an email notification any time a document is filed against a property. I had enrolled our address, which meant that on July 8th, while Daniel and I were eating grilled fish on a terrace in Albufeira and watching the Atlantic catch the afternoon light, my phone had received an email notification. I had seen it, I had read it, and I had, calmly on the terrace, while Daniel ordered dessert, forwarded it to Marcus Webb's email with the subject line, "This is what we talked about." Because I had also consulted Marcus Webb once before, 6 weeks before our vacation. I had come to his office alone, told him about my concerns, and asked him, if someone tried to file a fraudulent deed against our property while we were out of the country, what should I do and what would help? He had told me. I had done it. Marcus leaned back in his chair now and looked at me with something approaching professional admiration. "You already reported the alert to me from Portugal," he said. "I filed a fraud notice with the recorder's office on July 9th. Daniel turned to look at me. "You what?" "I'll explain everything," I told him. "Later. Right now, we need to focus." Here was what "check the mailbox" had meant. Marcus had sent a certified letter to our home address, to us on record, dated July 10th, acknowledging the fraud alert, confirming the filing of a legal notice of dispute, and notifying any interested parties that the property transfer was under formal legal challenge. It was sitting in our mailbox when we arrived home. When I told Patricia to check the mailbox, I already knew what was in it. But Patricia didn't know that yet. She didn't know I'd been watching. She didn't know that the moment her fraudulent deed hit the county recorder's database, a clock had started ticking. And that clock was already a week ahead of her. We filed the police report that afternoon. The officer who took our statement, a woman with reading glasses and a careful manner, told us deed fraud cases were taken seriously and that the involvement of a notary public would make the investigation easier, not harder, because notaries were licensed and traceable. That evening, I got a text from Patricia. Just 4 words. "We should talk, honey." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and went to make dinner. Renee, Daniel's sister, called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail, but I noted that she called and I filed it away. The question I kept returning to, standing at the stove while the water boiled, was not, can we win, but how deep does this go? Patricia had not done this alone. Someone had signed our names. Someone had notarized those signatures. And Renee, who called twice and left no message, was she just a worried daughter, or was she something else? I didn't have the answer yet, but I was going to find it. The plan moved forward on 3 tracks simultaneously. On the legal track, Marcus Webb filed our quiet title action in the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas on Thursday morning. The motion asked the court to declare the July 8th quitclaim deed void and fraudulent, restore the original title in our names, and enjoin Patricia from any further attempts to file documents against our property. Judge Harriet Bowen's clerk accepted the filing, and we were assigned a hearing date 5 weeks out. It wasn't fast, but it was formal and it was real, and the moment those papers were filed, the fraudulent deed was frozen. No bank would touch it. No sale could proceed. On the investigative track, the Columbus Police Department's Economic Crimes Unit contacted me to schedule a follow-up interview. The notary public, Gerald Holt, the man whose stamp appeared on the fraudulent deed, had already been contacted. His license, I was told without further detail, was under review. That told me something important. Gerald Holt was not a hardened criminal. He was a man who had done someone a favor and was now realizing what that favor had cost him. On the third track, the personal one, I began carefully and quietly gathering everything I had that documented Patricia's pattern of behavior. The check with the ownership clause, the text messages, the comments Daniel had heard and told me about. I was building a picture because I knew that when this went to court, Patricia's attorney would try to make me look unstable or vindictive, and I intended to be neither. I had been at this for exactly 9 days when Patricia made her move. It was a Wednesday evening. Daniel was at work. He was a project manager and had already missed more time than he could afford. And I was at the kitchen table with my laptop when the doorbell rang. I looked through the front window first. Patricia's white SUV was in the driveway, and beside it, a second car, Renee's gray sedan. They had come together. That told me everything. I opened the door. Patricia stood on the porch with her arms at her sides and her expression arranged into something she probably thought looked like dignity. Renee stood one step behind her, which was exactly where she always stood, behind Patricia, waiting. Renee was 32 years old and had never, as far as I knew, made a single significant decision without her mother's endorsement. "We need to talk," Patricia said. "We're in litigation," I said. "You should be having your attorney contact mine." "Sarah." Patricia's voice shifted into its lower register, the one she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. "This has gotten out of hand. There are things you don't understand about the situation." "Come in then," I said. I stepped back. They sat on the couch. I sat across from them in the armchair. I didn't offer coffee. Patricia began with what I recognized immediately as her opening gambit, the grievance inventory. She had sacrificed so much for Daniel. She had worked 2 jobs when he was in college. She had lent us money for the down payment. This was a lie. We had declined her money, but she said it anyway, calmly, as if saying it loudly enough would make it true. She talked about how her name deserved to be on this house, how it was practically her house already, how families kept property together. Renee, at the appropriate moments, nodded. I sat and listened with my hands in my lap and my face neutral. Then Patricia's voice changed again, dropped, hardened, and she said, "We know you've spoken to an attorney. We know about the filing, and I want you to understand that I have resources you're not aware of, Sarah. I have been in contact with people who tell me this case is weaker than you think. If you push this, it will cost you, financially and in other ways. Daniel doesn't need this kind of stress. Think about your marriage." Think about your marriage. There it was, the threat dressed as concern. I looked at Renee. Renee looked at the floor. "Patricia," I said, and I kept my voice very even, "you committed deed fraud. That is a felony. I didn't create this situation. I am responding to it. You had 2 choices when I came home. You could have admitted what you'd done and begun making it right, or you could escalate. You chose escalation. So did I." I stood up. "I think you should leave, and I think you should call your attorney tonight." Patricia stood. Her face had gone through several colors. "You don't know what you're doing," she said. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said. And I opened the front door. She left. Renee left behind her without making eye contact. I stood on the porch and watched the two cars back out of the driveway, and I kept my posture straight and my expression still until they turned the corner and disappeared. Then I went inside, sat down on the kitchen floor, not the chair, the floor, and put my head against the cabinet door and breathed. I gave myself the rest of that week, not to stop, the attorneys and the courts kept moving, but to rest inside the fight. I called my best friend Deanna, and she came over Friday night with takeout and wine, and I told her everything, and she said, "Sarah, you are the most prepared person I have ever met." And I laughed for the first time in 10 days. Daniel held me that night. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't see her clearly before this." I said, "You see her now." That was enough. The following Monday, an envelope arrived by courier. Inside was a single sheet of paper on the letterhead of an attorney named Raymond Schutt, a name I didn't recognize. The letter offered, on behalf of Patricia Mercer, a full and final settlement. Patricia would voluntarily vacate the fraudulent deed, acknowledge no wrongdoing, and pay us $15,000 in exchange for our agreement to drop all civil and criminal complaints, withdraw the quiet title action, and sign a non-disclosure agreement prohibiting us from discussing the matter with anyone. I read it twice. Then I photographed it, emailed it to Marcus, and set the original in my document folder. $15,000. Patricia thought that was the number. She thought she knew what we were worth. She thought that we were tired or frightened or stretched thin enough by legal fees that a check with enough zeros would make us fold. I want to be honest about something. For about 45 minutes, I considered it. Not seriously, not with any real intention of accepting, but I let myself sit with the offer long enough to feel its weight. $15,000. No more court dates. No more fear that the case would somehow turn. No more watching my husband age 10 years in 1 month. I sat with it and I felt its pull, and then I set it down. Because the non-disclosure agreement was the tell. Patricia didn't just want to keep the house. She'd lost that and she probably knew it. What she wanted was silence. She wanted this buried, which meant she was afraid of what would happen if it wasn't. And she was afraid of what was already in the mailbox, not the letter from Marcus Webb, though that had clearly rattled her. Something else. Something I had done in June, quietly, that she still didn't fully understand. I called Marcus that morning. "Decline it," I said, and write back formally. "I want everything on record." "Including the criminal complaint?" he asked. "Especially that," I said. That same week, something shifted in the people around us. Word, as it does in families and neighborhoods, had begun to travel. Daniel's aunt, his father's sister, a woman named Carol who had never particularly liked Patricia, called Daniel out of the blue and said, "I heard what happened. I want you to know I'm not surprised, and if you need a character witness, call me." A neighbor 2 doors down, a retired school teacher named Mr. Patterson, who had watched our house while we were in Portugal, told me he had seen Patricia's car parked in front of our house twice during the 2 weeks we were gone. He had thought nothing of it at the time. Now he offered to give a written statement. I accepted. I thanked him and meant it. Deanna, who worked in human resources and knew how organizations protected themselves, drove me to a legal document service one afternoon and helped me organize my evidence files into a binder that would have made a paralegal proud. 3-hole punched, labeled, chronological. She said it the way a good friend says hard truths. Patricia underestimated you because she thinks you're soft. You are not soft. I wasn't. I was something quieter and harder than soft. I was patient. I had been patient for 3 years, cataloging every small cruelty, every boundary crossed, every moment in which I had been dismissed or diminished or managed. I had been a fair witness to Patricia and a fair witness to myself, and now I was being a fair witness to the evidence. That was all. The police investigation had progressed. Gerald Holt, the notary, had been contacted for a formal interview. I learned through Marcus, who learned through the prosecutor's office, that Holt was cooperating. He had told investigators that he had been asked a favor by someone he knew through Patricia's church. He had not met Patricia personally, but had been told the property owners had verbally consented and were traveling. He had believed it. He was foolish and he was culpable, but he was not malicious and he was talking. Somewhere in the network around Patricia, a seam was opening. On Thursday evening, my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I answered. "Mrs. Mercer Calloway?" A woman's voice, careful and neutral. "Speaking." "This is Detective Lana Rosario from the Franklin County Economic Crimes Unit. I'd like to schedule a time to meet with you and your husband about the statements we've collected." "Of course," I said. "When?" That night, I slept better than I had in weeks, not because the fear was gone. It wasn't. But because the fear had been replaced by something more useful, something steady and clear. Forward, I thought. Keep moving forward. They came on a Saturday. Daniel was in the backyard cutting back the overgrown rose bushes. He'd been doing a lot of physical work lately, the kind that let him be quiet inside. And I was at the kitchen table going through emails when I heard a car in the driveway. 2 cars, actually. I knew them both. I watched through the kitchen window as Patricia and Renee got out, and then, which surprised me, as a third person emerged from Renee's car, a man I recognized as Pastor Gerald Finn of the Millbrook Community Church that Patricia attended. He was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who had presided over Daniel's father's funeral and whom I had met twice. He was here, I understood immediately, not as a religious figure, but as a character witness, an emotional pressure point. Patricia had done her homework. The doorbell rang. I let it ring once more. Then I opened the door. Patricia was wearing a church dress. Renee was holding a covered dish, something baked by the smell of it. Pastor Finn had his hands folded in front of him and wore a look of beatific concern. "Sarah," Patricia said, and her voice was different from every previous encounter. Softer, more careful, constructed note by note like a piece of furniture assembled to look antique. "We came to apologize." I looked at the dish in Renee's hands. I looked at Pastor Finn. I looked at Patricia. "Come in," I said. We sat in the living room. The pastor perched on the edge of the armchair I usually sat in. Patricia and Renee took the couch. I stood for a moment, then sat in the straight-back chair I'd pulled from the dining room, which put me higher than the couch, and outside their arranged semicircle. Small details matter. Patricia spoke for 15 minutes. It was, I will acknowledge, an impressive performance. She spoke about grief, her grief over losing Daniel's father, her fear of being pushed out of her son's life, her love for this house because Daniel had grown up visiting it with her, which was completely false since we'd bought it 3 years ago, but she said it as if it were a memory. She cried, not dramatically, but with the particular restraint of someone who has practiced. She said she had made a terrible mistake and wanted to make it right as a family. Renee, at the appropriate moment, reached over and squeezed her hand. Pastor Finn said gently that families healed through forgiveness, and that the courts were a cold place that left everyone worse off. And then, just as I had waited for, the structure of the visit revealed itself. Patricia looked at me with wet eyes and said, "All I'm asking, Sarah, is that you withdraw the criminal complaint. Let the civil matter resolve quietly. I'll sign whatever documents you need for the house. We don't need the police involved. Think about what that does to our family. Think about what that does to Daniel." Think about Daniel. There it was again. I had thought about Daniel. I had thought about almost nothing else for the past 3 weeks, but I had also thought about Gerald Holt, whose notary license was now suspended, and about the person, not yet identified, who had actually signed our names on that deed, and about what happens when fraud goes unpunished because the victim decides family is more important than accountability. I looked at Patricia. I looked at Renee. I looked at Pastor Finn. "I appreciate that you came," I said. "I can see this is difficult." I paused. "But I have to be direct with you. What happened to our property was a crime. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding. A crime. Gerald Holt has given a statement. The document forensics on the deed are complete. I am not going to withdraw the criminal complaint, and I'm going to be honest with you about why. Because if I do, I make it possible for this to happen to someone else. Maybe to Daniel and me in some other form. Maybe to someone else entirely." I stood up. I think the pastor would agree that accountability and forgiveness are not mutually exclusive. Pastor Finn blinked. He had not, I think, expected to be quoted against himself. Patricia stood too. The soft voice was gone. "You are making a mistake," she said, and the word mistake came out like something she was spitting. "You think you understand this family. You think you understand what you're dealing with. You have no idea." She picked up her purse. "Don't think this is over." "It will be over," I said, "when the court says it is." Renee stood, looked at me once, a strange, complicated look that I couldn't quite read, somewhere between apology and resentment, and followed her mother to the door. Pastor Finn left last, quietly, without looking at me directly. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment with my back against it. My pulse was moving fast. My hands were steady, but my pulse was fast, and I noticed it, not with panic, but with something almost like gratitude, because I had learned to use fear the way a navigator uses weather. It told me where I was. It told me the stakes were real. I went out to the backyard. Daniel was still working on the roses. I sat on the back steps and watched him, and he looked up. "They came, didn't they?" he said. It wasn't a question. "They came," I said. He set down the pruning shears and came to sit beside me on the steps, and we sat in the afternoon sun in our backyard, and I thought, this is still ours. This is still exactly ours, and no one was going to change that. The hearing before Judge Harriet Bowen was scheduled for a Tuesday in September, which meant that summer had entirely given way by the time we drove downtown and parked in the courthouse garage and rode the elevator up to the 3rd floor. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined. Wood-paneled, fluorescent lit, with 6 rows of benches and a clerk who typed steadily without looking up. Patricia was already there with her attorney, Raymond Schutt, the man who had sent the settlement offer. He was a compact, gray-suited man who looked as if he had spent his career settling things before they became problems. Patricia had dressed for a different story than the one she was in. Navy blazer, pearl earrings, a careful expression of wounded dignity. Renee sat 2 rows behind her in the gallery. Daniel sat beside me at our table. Marcus Webb arranged his documents with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this many times and trusted the preparation. The clerk called the case. Judge Bowen looked at the parties over the edge of her reading glasses with the steady gaze of someone who has sorted the truthful from the performative many times before. "Mr. Shutt," she said, "I've read your client's response brief. Your position is that the deed transfer was authorized through a verbal family agreement. Is that correct?" "That's correct, Your Honor," Shutt said. "The Mercer family has a long-standing understanding about the property." "A verbal agreement," the judge said, "cannot transfer real property under Ohio law. That's foundational. A deed requires written consent and a valid notarized signature. Let's talk about those signatures." Marcus had subpoenaed the original deed and submitted it to a forensic document examiner, a specialist whose report had been filed with the court. The examiner's findings: the signatures on the deed were not consistent with our authentic signatures on other legal documents. Specifically, the S formation in Sarah showed a pen pressure pattern inconsistent with my natural handwriting. Daniel's signature had been copied from what the examiner believed was a prior document, likely a mortgage refinancing application from 2 years ago, and showed telltale signs of tracing. When Marcus presented this report, Shutt objected 3 times. Judge Bowen overruled him 3 times with the same quiet finality. And then came Gerald Holt. Holt was not in the courtroom. His testimony had been submitted as a written statement to the prosecutor's office, and Marcus had subpoenaed its relevant portions. But his statement named the person who had contacted him and arranged the notarization. It was not Patricia. It was a woman named Donna Siebert, who attended Patricia's church, who had done a notarization as a favor, having been told by Patricia that the property owners were traveling and had given their verbal consent. Patricia, when the name Donna Siebert was read aloud in the courtroom, made a very small sound, just barely audible. Her attorney put a hand briefly on her arm. But here is what broke the performance entirely. Marcus stood and said, "Your Honor, I'd also like to draw the court's attention to Exhibit 17, a series of text messages between Mrs. Patricia Mercer and her daughter, Renee Mercer, sent in the months preceding the fraudulent filing." The texts had come from Renee, not as a betrayal exactly. They had been obtained through the discovery process. The civil litigation required both sides to produce relevant communications, and Renee had been named as a potential witness. Her attorney, yes, Renee had eventually retained her own attorney, which told me she understood exactly what exposure she faced, had produced the messages under subpoena. In those messages, sent between February and June of that year, Patricia had described the house as Daniel's birthright, had referred to me as that woman, had written in one message, "Once they're in Portugal, I'll have Donna do the notary. It just needs to be filed before they get back." And Renee had responded in writing, "Mom, are you sure about this?" To which Patricia had responded, "I've looked into it. It'll be done." "I've looked into it." Judge Bowen read the messages. She read them without expression. Then she looked up at Patricia, looked directly at her, the way judges look at people when the record is already written, and said, "Mrs. Mercer, I want to give you an opportunity to address this court directly. Is there anything you wish to say?" Patricia stood. Shutt started to object, and she put her hand up sideways, silencing her own attorney. And she turned to face the judge with the pearl earrings and the navy blazer, and 30 seconds of silence that told everyone in the room everything they needed to know. "I was protecting my son's interests," she said, "by forging his wife's signature without her knowledge," the judge said. Yes. The word came out wrong. She heard it come out wrong. "That is, what I mean is..." "Thank you, Mrs. Mercer," the judge said. I sat at our table with my hands flat on the wood surface, and I did not look at Patricia, and I did not feel triumph. I felt something quieter, the recognition that the truth, once it is properly assembled and presented, does not need to be performed. It stands on its own. It had always been standing on its own. I had just needed to clear away the noise. I looked once at Daniel. He was looking at his hands. I reached over and covered his hand with mine. He turned it over and held on. Judge Bowen issued her ruling from the bench that afternoon, which Marcus told me afterward was unusual. Most judges took matters like this under submission and issued written decisions days or weeks later. That she ruled immediately told us something about how clearly the record had spoken. She declared the July 8th quitclaim deed void and fraudulent in its entirety. She ordered the Franklin County Recorder's Office to expunge it from the property records and restore the original title in the names of Daniel Edward Mercer and Sarah Lynn Mercer Calloway. She ordered Patricia to pay our attorney's fees, a figure that Marcus had carefully documented and that came to just over $22,000. She issued a permanent injunction prohibiting Patricia from filing any document against our property without explicit court approval, and she referred the matter to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office with a recommendation for criminal charges. That last part was not a guarantee of prosecution. I understood that. Criminal charges depend on prosecutorial discretion, available resources, the weight of other cases. But the referral was formal and documented, and it was entered into the record, and it meant that Patricia Mercer's name and her actions were now part of a permanent public record that no settlement agreement and no non-disclosure clause could touch. The $15,000 she had offered us felt very small against that reality. She had tried to buy our silence before the truth had a chance to speak. She had miscalculated what our silence was actually worth. Raymond Schutt began speaking the moment the judge finished. Something about appeals, about procedural objections, about points of law that had not been fully argued. Judge Bowen listened for approximately 30 seconds and said, "File your motion, Mr. Schutt." Then she left the bench. I stood. I picked up my bag. I shook Marcus Webb's hand and said, "Thank you." He said, "You did the work. I just presented it." In the hallway outside the courtroom, Patricia was speaking in a low, fast voice to Schutt, while Renee stood nearby with her arms wrapped around herself. As Daniel and I walked past, Patricia turned and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It wasn't anger exactly. It was the look of someone who has been so certain of their own map of the world that the moment it fails them, they have no way to orient. She looked, for the first time since I had known her, genuinely small. Not because I had humiliated her, I hadn't tried to, but because the architecture she had built around herself, the certainty that she was always the one who decided things, had simply collapsed under the weight of its own dishonesty. I did not stop. I did not speak to her. But Renee looked up as we passed, and her expression was different. It was just tired. 20 years of standing one step behind someone else. And for what? She had retained her own attorney and ultimately cooperated with discovery, which meant she had made a calculation at some point that her mother's plan was not worth her own protection. I felt no warmth toward Renee, but I felt something for that tiredness. We walked to the elevator. The doors closed. Daniel exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to release something he had been holding since we pulled into our own driveway in July and found his mother standing on our porch. He put his arm around me. I leaned into him. "Is it done?" he asked. "The civil case is done," I said. "The criminal referral is up to the prosecutor, but yes, it's done." 3 weeks later, the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office filed charges against Patricia Mercer for 1 count of deed fraud under Ohio Revised Code 2913.02 and 1 count of forgery under ORC 2913.31. Donna Siebert, the church acquaintance who had provided the notarization, was charged with unlawful notarization and complicity to fraud. Lesser charges that reflected her lesser culpability, but were charges nonetheless. Gerald Holt, the original notary, had been cooperating fully since July. His license had already been suspended by the Ohio Secretary of State's Notary Commission. Whether he faced criminal charges was between him and the prosecutor. Patricia retained a criminal defense attorney, a different one, not shut, and entered a not guilty plea. That was her right. The process would take time, but the house was ours. That evening, Daniel and I drove home and parked in our driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The porch light was on. The rose bushes had been trimmed back neatly. The neighbors' sprinklers were going across the street. Everything looked exactly as we had left it in July before the world tilted. And yet it felt different now. Not fragile, the way it had felt the night we came home from Portugal. Solid, settled. Ours in a way that had been tested and confirmed by something harder than paperwork. "I want to paint the porch this fall," I said. "Blue," Daniel said. "Navy blue," I said. "Like the ocean." He laughed. It was the first real, unguarded laugh I had heard from him in 2 months. We went inside. The paint went up in October, a deep navy blue that made the Craftsman porch look exactly right, like something that had always been that color and would be that color for the next 100 years. I did 2 coats myself on a Saturday while Daniel was at a friend's football game, and I listened to a podcast about architecture, and the afternoon sun moved across the yard, and I thought, this is what normal feels like. I had forgotten. Fall moved through the neighborhood gently. The maple in the front yard turned red, then gold, then bare. I put out pumpkins on the porch steps. I started a book club with Deanna and 3 women from my office. I took a ceramics class on Tuesday evenings at the Community Arts Center, something I had wanted to do for years and had always postponed, because postponement is easy and life is full of reasons to wait. I stopped waiting. Daniel and I went to couples counseling, not because we were in crisis, but because we had been through something that had put pressure on every seam of our marriage, and we were both smart enough to want the help. The therapist was a soft-spoken man named Dr. Okafor, who had a habit of asking questions that sounded simple until you tried to answer them. It helped. It helped more than I expected. Daniel talked about his mother in those sessions, really talked, without defending or excusing, and I listened, and something between us that had been held at a slight, careful distance for years moved back to where it belonged. We talked about children. We talked about the house, not the legal battle of it, but the life of it. What room we'd convert, what color we'd paint the nursery. It was the right conversation to be having in the right house. Now, what happened to Patricia? I tell this part not with satisfaction, but with the careful honesty I've tried to apply to everything else. The criminal case resolved in early spring. Patricia entered a plea agreement, not the outcome she had wanted, but her attorney had apparently concluded correctly that a trial would be worse. She pleaded guilty to a reduced charge, a 5th-degree felony count of misuse of credit, a charge that carried with it 3 years of probation, a fine mandatory restitution, which added to the civil attorney's fees we'd already been awarded, and a formal criminal record. She did not go to prison, but she was convicted. Her name was in the public record. The conviction cost her in ways that went beyond the legal. She was asked to step back from her volunteer role at her church, delicately in the language churches use when they want someone gone without conflict, but ask nonetheless. Two of her closest friends from the neighborhood, women she had known for 15 years, stopped calling. I learned this not through gossip, but through Daniel's Aunt Carol, who kept us occasionally informed with the neutral tone of someone reporting weather. Renee. Renee was a more complicated story. She had not been charged. Her cooperation with discovery and the fact that she had asked her mother, "Are you sure about this?" and received no further knowledge of the mechanics had kept her legally clear. But something between her and Patricia had fractured in the process, the dynamic that had kept Renee standing one step behind her mother for 30 years, the thing that had made her hold a casserole dish while Patricia delivered ultimatums, seemed to have finally, quietly, broken. By late winter, Renee had moved to a new apartment in a different part of the city. She had started therapy, according to Carol. She and Daniel exchanged a few careful texts. Nothing resolved, nothing promised, but the door not entirely closed. I did not have a relationship with Renee. I did not try to have one. But I was willing, when Daniel was ready, to follow his lead. As for Daniel and me, we didn't leave the house. Some people, after something like this, want to sell and start fresh somewhere the bad memory can't follow. I understood that impulse, but I felt differently. Patricia had tried to take the house from us. The most complete answer to that was to stay in it and make it more ours than it had ever been. Every room I repainted, every tile I regrouted, every Saturday morning I spent gardening in the backyard while the coffee went cold on the porch rail, it was ours. On a Thursday in April, I was working in the front yard when Mr. Patterson, the retired school teacher, came by on his afternoon walk with his dog. He stopped at the fence. "That navy blue suits the house," he said. "Thank you," I said. "I painted it myself." "Good," he said. "It should be done by the people who live here." He walked on. His dog looked back at me once and then trotted after him. I stood in my garden in the April afternoon and looked at my house, the craftsman porch, the navy trim, the climbing rose coming back along the railing, and I felt something that I had spent a long time in the middle of all of this, being afraid I would lose. I felt at home. Patricia showed me who she was on day one. I saw it. I filed it away and called it sensitivity. The lesson, for me, for anyone listening, is that the small moments are not small. The comment that makes you uneasy, the boundary that's crossed quietly, the look on someone's face when they don't know you're watching, these are data. Trust them. So here is my question to you. If someone you loved showed you who they were, quietly, early, before the crisis, what would you do with that information? I'd love to hear your answer. Leave it in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need it. Thank you for listening to the whole thing. It still means something to me that you did.